I'm from Iowa, and when I turned 16, some jackass in California stole my city's operating budget. And the wisdom of the city council that year was that in order to rebuild our budget, we're just not going to do any services for 24 months, but we're going to still charge taxes. So I learned to drive in what turned out to be the snowiest year in Iowa history on 6 inches of ice for 4 months. And then when I was 22, I worked as a backcountry manager at Philmont, and the guy who taught me how to drive on mountain roads was the chaplain. And wow, you have not gotten a driving lesson unless your instructor has God as a co-pilot. So I'm going 40 miles an hour down these back roads in order to get to the highway. The highway has barely been cleared at all. It's immediately obvious who just moved from Texas. But I'm slaloming in and out of the traffic. I get ahead of the snowplow. That was fun. I'm not just on time, I'm ahead of schedule. I would have been early, but I run into that one guy who decided that today is when I want to move my boat. But I get there because I was trained, I was prepared, there was gas in the snowblower. I know how to operate in these conditions. But I was the only speaker that made it because the others didn't know how to operate in this sort of environment. So, this is great for me because I got kind of promoted. I got a 3 for 1. They just had me there for 4.5 hours. For producers, this is the environment we're going to be in for the next few years. You're ready, you're prepared, you've got some experience under your belt, you know how to make it work in changing conditions. Most of the competition is not going to make it. Now, for those of you who are not producers, your job is going to be to keep up with the producers because they're going to be changing more things more rapidly than we have seen in the last 50 years. And it's all going to happen in the next 3. Oops. We have to start with the war. On the left, you're dealing with a climate and economic map of the former Soviet space. These maps are on their side, so if you turn your head, it's okay. If you're on the right, same map, but now we're looking at population density. Now, on the map on the right, the population density, that lighter color of orange, is roughly the population density of Kansas if you remove Topeka and Kansas City. So yes, you have neighbors. You've probably lost track of the details of their lives. If you go to the left, the green zone is what they call the Russian wheat belt. That is the primary agricultural zone in the former Soviet world. It is the least productive of the major agricultural zones worldwide. The problem is primarily climate. In the summer, it's about the same as western Kansas, so hot and dry. In the winter, it's about the same as northeastern Alberta, so cold, dry, windy. The output per acre is the lowest productivity of any wheat zone, any agricultural zone in the world. And the income that comes from that agricultural production is so low and so erratic that the Russians, even today, have not been able to build a national road network. You want to do anything at scale in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, you have to move things by rail. It's your only option. Now, if you go to the south, to the yellow to the left, you're in desert, completely empty. If you go to the right, to the north, to the blue, you're in tundra and taiga, also completely empty. But what makes the Russians drink is the beige, the stuff on the shoulders, territories that are completely useless from their definition, but they're flat and they're wide open. And you can totally shove a Mongol horde through that. The Russians have been invaded 50-odd times in their history. Every time the invader has made it to the green where they actually live, the Russians have never driven them out. It's been the weather. The Russians have discovered over the last 350 years that the only way that they can protect the wheat belt is if they expand beyond it through the beige and reach a series of geographic barriers that you can't run a panzer division through. And then forward position those rail-supplied military forces in the access points between those barriers, static defense, plug the gaps. If they do that, they can prevent the war from coming to them. That's the only defensive strategy they have. And this is everything that Putin has attempted to do in the last 23 years. This is the Kazakh intervention and the Karabakh War and the Georgia War and the Crimea War. It's about getting troops into those gaps and plugging them. The problem for Ukraine, of course, is not that it controls any of these gaps, but it's on the way to 2 of them. The Russians were always going to do this. They were always going to try to not just take parts of Ukraine, but all of it. And then they would move beyond into the countries that actually control the territories they care about. That's Poland, that's Romania, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. These are all NATO allies. We've always known this was going to go down. Now, who here is not from Texas? It's not as big as they say it is. The scale of what the Russians are attempting here, we have a hard time wrapping our minds around. I mean, the United States is a big country, but it's nothing compared to the sheer physical size of Russia. Their borders are 3 times as long. They're trying to patrol them with a population that's half as big. It was always going to be a desperate fight. All right, that's the big strategic picture. Let's look at the tactical. The dotted lines on this map are those all-important rail connections. The deep red are the territories that the Russians controlled at the end of the last war in 2014. So anyone who tells you that, if you just give the Russians a little bit, they'll stop, no, because this was the 7th time they've done this since 1992. And then third, those pinker areas are the areas that the Russians held as of the 1st of September in the current war. This is Kherson. It's the only territory west of the Dnieper River that the Russians were able to capture earlier in the war. And the Ukrainians made it very clear around August, actually July, that this is where they were going to go first. This was the territory they were going to try to liberate because it was on the other side of the river. It would be easier to do. The Russians saw these advertisements, forward positioned about another 20,000 troops there, the best troops that they had. Now, as we all know, that wasn't the end of the story. I mean, yes, the assault did begin on September 1, but there was also a second piece to it because the Ukrainians watched to see where the Russians pulled those troops from and launched an assault there in Kharkiv. And without the Russian forces in place, the Kharkiv front collapsed in 5 days. Best of all, you'll notice just south of where those arrows connect, there's a little dingleberry of pink. That is the city of Izium. That was their forward positioned base. They were planning on launching multiple assaults from that. It fell in 36 hours. But since it was their forward logistics base, that's where all their tanks and all their artillery were. And so in 36 hours, the Ukrainians captured more equipment from the Russians than they started the war with. And territory switched hands. What we're going through right now is a logistical war, because remember, the Russians have to have rail connections. This is the Kerch Strait Bridge. This is the only rail connection between mainland Russia and the entirety of the southern front. And a couple months back, somebody blew it up, and so now the Russians have to move everything by truck. This is a problem. The Russians only started the war with about 3,000 tactical support trucks for their entire military. You guys remember all those javelins? Most of those were not targeting tanks, they were targeting trucks. And they've already lost 80% of their entire fleet. So the Russian military has had to go back to Russia and confiscate city buses and literally Scooby-Doo vans from every one of their municipalities to bring back to shuttle artillery shells around the front. And I gotta tell you, when a Scooby-Doo van laden with artillery shells hits a bump, shit gets real very fast. But this is where the war is going to be decided. This is the Crimea Canal. Remember, Russia's dry. So is Ukraine. 80% of the food that is grown in the Crimean Peninsula is grown with irrigated water sources. That water source is in Kherson, and the Ukrainians now control the sluice gates, and they're not going to open it this year. So without Kerch to bring in food in bulk by rail, and without the canal that would allow Crimea to grow their own, we are going to have a 1980s-style famine in Crimea later this year. Russia fights until it can't. It has never backed down from any war without losing at least 500,000 men in combat first. Right now, they're about 100,000. This is how you trigger a mass casualty event. We will see that later this year. Now, does that mean that the Ukrainians or the Russians are destined to win? No. This is still totally up in the air. Because the Ukrainians are in the process now of doing a lot of deferred maintenance on equipment. They've captured from the Russians 3 times as much tanks and artillery as they started the war with, in addition to everything that NATO has given them. But the Russians are in the process of doing a separate mobilization. And by the time we get to May, there's going to be at least 500,000 more Russians in the field. This is going to be a very different conflict very soon. The stakes are high. Now, the question, of course, is why does the United States care? You know, freedom, blah, 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 democracy, blah, blah, blah. They're coming for Poland and Romania. That's the issue. When the war started, you guys remember in the first week, and it looked like it was all already over? There's that 40-mile-long convoy of military vehicles going from Belarus south to Kiev. And then on the 4th day of the war, the convoy stopped unexpectedly. And we found out a couple days later that's because the Russians forgot to bring fuel. And then 3 days later, all the soldiers in those vehicles got out of their vehicles and walked back to Belarus because they also forgot to bring food. And in the NATO defense ministries, we came to the conclusion very quickly that the Russians don't know how to fight a modern war. They're doing worse. They have been doing worse this entire time than the Iraqis did during Desert Storm in '92. And we now know that if NATO and Russia meet on the field of battle, we will obliterate them. There will be 1,000-to-1 casualty ratios. It will be a complete conventional wipeout. And that made no one in NATO happy. Because for the Russians, they see this as a fight for their existential survival, and they are correct. If they lose this war, this is the end of the Russian Federation. Which means if they can succeed in Ukraine, when they come for Poland and Romania and the rest, they will absolutely use nukes because they know a conventional fight cannot be won. We know we will have a general nuclear exchange if the Russians win this first phase. So the decision was made early to give the Ukrainians anything that they can use that isn't a security risk for us in order to make sure that the Russian military dies here and now and forever. That was our lesson. The Russians took a different lesson. They're like, maybe we shouldn't have drank all of our own Kool-Aid. Maybe these are not devil-worshipping Nazis. Maybe they will fight for their own lands. And if that's the case, the civilian population is no longer a non-factor. They need to be dealt with. So they dusted off a strategy that dates back to the 1800s. And when they advance very slowly, no more than a mile a day, behind a hail of artillery, targeting not anything that moves, but anything that stands. Because if they completely obliterate all civilian infrastructure, then Ukraine cannot support a civilian population at all. And the population will self-segregate into refugees, which will run, which you never have to deal with it again. And anyone who stays who's under age 55 clearly stayed to fight, and you can shoot them on sight. The agricultural infrastructure is their primary target. Because if you can't feed the locals go, or they die. And it's that simple. It's hard to get numbers in a war zone, especially behind occupied territory. But the best guess is we're dealing with over 250,000 civilian deaths and at least 12 million refugees. That's similar to the pace of the Holocaust in World War II. It's all about scale. Now, we're going to throw a bunch of these up as we go. This is an import-export graphic for corn specifically. It comes from the green countries, it goes to the red countries. Corn is a squiggly little product because it can only be grown in a few places that have the right humidity profile. Now here in the Midwest, we're like, woo, not everyone can grow corn. Mid-continent humid summers, that's what you need. You don't have that in most of the world. In fact, in the Eastern Hemisphere, the only place you have it at all is Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians have been shifting their export portfolio because there's a war on. They're focusing on the things they can get the most bang for the buck for. So there's a UN program to help ships get in and out of Ukrainian ports that at the moment the Russians have signed off for. But it's very limited. And so they've stopped exporting wheat for the most part. They've shifted everything to corn. Corn exports are actually up a little bit. but it's not a stable system. Right now, the Russians are targeting civilian infrastructure, specifically electricity infrastructure, in the interest of causing as much terror, disruption, and civilian deaths as possible. But it's winter. That's why that strategy has been chosen. Fast forward a few months to summer. You take out the power in Kiev, doesn't matter so much. That's when they'll go after the ports to try to hit the economic lifeline. So we should expect this year agricultural exports from the Ukrainian space to largely stop. There'll still be some stuff by rail, that's less than 10% of the total. There's a different rail gauge between Ukraine and the rest of Europe. So for those of you who care about corn, you're about to lose the number 4 producer in the world. Now, before you get too excited about that, keep in mind, I'm going to be talking here about a lot of other agricultural products. We're going to be seeing disruptions all over the place. To think that in this country, if we're dealing with global food shortages, we're going to continue with the fuel standard in its current form without a conversation, you got your head in the clouds. I'm not saying ethanol is going away. I'm saying in the next couple of years, we're going to have an open, honest, deep conversation in this country about whether we want to feed the world or fuel. I don't know how that's going to go, but that conversation will start by the end of this year. All right, let's talk about some non-ag stuff. You guys care about commodities in general, and some of these are hilarious. So if you take the first column, this is where all of the people involved in the world are collectively the world's largest supplier. They're the second largest for the second column, and so on. Just going to pull a few of these out. Let's say you care about the environment and think that EVs and solar panels or nuclear power are the way to go. If you want to do the full transition, we need twice as much copper as we have now. We need 10 times as much lithium. We need 4 times as much chromium. Well, the Russians are a top 3 supplier for a number of things that we absolutely have to do the transition at scale. So not only do we need to massively expand global access, we need to keep the Russians in the game, and they're not. Which means the green transition in its current imagining is completely impossible. This is where things get dark. The world's #1 wheat exporter has invaded the 5 wheat exporter and is deliberately destroying all agricultural infrastructure. There's no way that doesn't have massive supply, famine, and cost implications. Oh, this is hilarious. Okay, so the former Soviet Union doesn't have bauxite. That's the stuff you use to make aluminum. They have to import it all. They use the spare electricity systems because when the Soviet system collapsed, their industry went away, but their power generation was okay. So they've got the cheapest power in the world after the United States. So they bring in the bauxite, they process it into metal themselves, and then they send it out. All the bauxite came from Ireland and Australia, which decided that they don't want to support a genocide, and so they stopped export. So the aluminum system is in the process of collapsing in Russia. Titanium, the ore comes from Ukraine, but it's processed in Russia. So that's gone to zero as well. You guys have heard about Brexit? So the Brits can't figure out what the hell's going on. They know they have to have a trade deal with the United States in order to move forward. And the US has made it very clear, this is great, we'll talk about the details, but just so we're clear, your participation in European aerospace has to go away. Well, Airbus, the European consortium, is Spanish and French and German and British aerospace companies. And we're telling them that they have to basically join Boeing. The primary consumer for former Soviet titanium and aluminum is Airbus. So European aerospace's future is one without the components the Brits provide, which are the wings and the engines, and without aluminum or titanium. You want to buy a company in aerospace? Boeing's the only one left. The Air Force thinks that's hilarious. Neon's a fun one. You guys all know Star Wars, right? Star Wars? One person knows Star Wars. Okay. Now, I'm not talking here about like lightsabers and bzzz. I'm talking about Reagan. Do you guys remember Reagan? 3 people remember Reagan. Come on, people, work with me. Okay, back in 1983, Reagan and Gorbachev were kicking it in Iceland, having hot dogs, because that's what you do. And this was their first meeting. They got along so well that they kicked all their aides out. It was just them and the translators. And they decided to get rid of nuclear weapons. And Gorbachev's like, this is great, peace in our time, but there's just one little catch, Ronnie. You got this idea called Star Wars with a giant space laser shield that's going to shoot down missiles. Now, if we each have 30,000 nuclear weapons, that's irrelevant. But if we only have a few dozen, that might actually work. So for this project to get off the ground, for this to be fair, Star Wars has to go away. And Reagan said something very Reagan-like, along the lines of, well, Mikhail, I didn't realize that you thought life was fair. And that was the end of the summit. So Gorbachev goes home, convinced that giant space lasers are the future of great power competition, gives the order to build out the supply chains to make it happen, but then the Soviet system collapses. But not before the supply chain went into place. Part of that was neon. Neon is used to focus the apertures of the lasers. And it's produced in a two-step process. Step one, you are in a steel facility where you have an air separation unit. And it takes the air and separates out the nitrogen and the oxygen, which you push into the foundry to get whatever you want. Everything else goes into a canister that goes to a more advanced facility where it's all separated into the trace gases, the carbon dioxide, the helium, the neon. Well, that first stage separation is done in southern Russia, in facilities that are under sanctions and are shutting down. The second stage separation is done exclusively in Ukraine, primarily in Mariupol, which no longer exists because it was leveled. Now, we don't use neon for giant space lasers today, but we do use it in the etching lasers in semiconductor fabrication facilities. And we've just lost 80% of global supply, which means later this year, we get to decide what goes back to analog. Phones, cars, the Internet of Things? Don't know. We haven't made that decision yet. So we don't just need Ukraine. We don't just need Russia. We don't just need Russia and Ukraine working together. We now also need Cher. Nobody. Cher, she turns back time. Oh, tough crowd. Okay, fine, back to agriculture. This is where I get my nightmares. It's not so much that the former Soviet world is one of the world's largest producers of foodstuffs, but they are by far the world's largest producer of the things that allows the rest of the world to grow their own. Fertilizers of all type, Russia as a unit is the world's single largest supplier. Russia plus Belarus specifically are 40% of global potash. Output of fertilizer and fertilizer inputs from the former Soviet space are down by 20 to 40% based on which nutrient you're talking about. It's not coming back because most of these facilities are maintained by foreigners with various investment in technological skills and skilled labor, and that's all gone. And we've already seen some industrial accidents in the Russian space that are so big that you can see them from orbit. I'm not saying this is going to zero, but this stuff is not coming back once it goes offline. Okay, let's get into energy. So we have that under our belt. This is a pipeline map. We're going to talk first about the green, that is oil. And the story has to do with these two export points. The ports in the north on the Baltic Sea, that is Primorsk, and Novorossiysk on the Black Sea in the south. The problem is insurance. Yeah, and it's like, I thought I was losing you before, now I hear say insurance. This gets really sexy, really fast. So, part of the sanctions program is that the Russians can't get insurance for their vessels. And as of January 1, so 3 days ago, all the reinsurance companies have canceled all coverage for all parts of the former Soviet world. It's already done. Now, it's going to take a few weeks for this to feed through the system, but it's already started. Which means that any tanker sailing out of these ports has to get an indemnification coverage from a sovereign nation if it's going to operate. But the only countries that are left to do this, China and India, have never done this before. The first time anything happens to any of these vessels, it goes straight into international arbitration, which will take years to resolve, which means that any ship captain is not going to accept insurance and indemnifications from these countries. We're just waiting for an incident now. It could happen a year from now. It could happen today. There's no way to know. But as soon as we get a disruption, maritime exports stop. Now, this isn't Texas, so this is a real problem. In Texas, if oil prices or takeaway capacity fails, you can shut in the well and turn it on later. You can't do that in Siberia. For those of you who are from like kind of the Missouri-Iowa border north, you understand in the winter, as long as you keep moving, you're fine. But if you stop, you freeze to death, and it's a horrible way to go. Same with crude oil. Most crude oil in western Siberia is produced in the permafrost. And as the oil comes up through the frozen subsoil layer, as long as it's moving, it's okay. But if it stops for any reason, it turns to gel. And the water that comes up as a byproduct freezes into ice. And when water freezes, it expands and it pops the pipes from the inside. The last time this went down was 1992 with the Soviet collapse. It took them 30 years to repair the damage. They didn't get back to 1988 production levels until January of 2022. And now it's all going to unwind again. Now there is a bit of a buffer. About 1 million barrels per day of Western Russian production is not in the permafrost. They can shut that off and on, and they have already. But just in the last 4 days, output from Russia has dropped by 750,000 barrels. They only have 250,000 barrels left of flexibility. And after that, you're talking about shutting in those permafrost wells, and they will never come back. If we get an incident insurance today, you will see permanent damage to the Russian export capacity within a month. Now, what does that do to prices? That's a little bit harder of a forecast. All else being equal, which it never is, you remove 4 million barrels a day of Russian output from the system, you get $150 to $180 oil. Oil is an inelastic product. You have to have it. If you need 50 gallons in order to deal with your field, and you can only get 40 gallons, it's not like you just write off the rest. No, you pay whatever you have to do to get that last 10 gallons. But the price you have to pay for that last 10 determines the price for the entire market. The marginal demand, the marginal supply, that sets the price. So losing 4% of global oil is more than enough to double prices. All else being equal. All right, same map. We're looking at the red now, the natural gas. This is the one that matters here. This is the Nord Stream pipeline. This is not a marginal supplier to Europe. This is Germany's primary source, 40% of the total. Somebody blew it up over last summer. Now, the Germans have succeeded at replacing the volumes that they need. They used 7 different marginal suppliers. So prices as of the 1st of December were 6 times what they were before the war. Now, prices, as you may have noticed, have gone briefly negative in Germany because energy is volatile. Nothing's changed. And they're also having a freakishly warm winter. It's actually about 60 degrees in Berlin today, which is batshit. Shouldn't count on that lasting. It's still winter. Now, the problem here is that the Germans don't think of energy the way that we do. I mean, we talk a good paranoid game about energy security, but we really don't care where we get it. So we produce a bunch ourselves. We get some from Mexico, some from Canada, some from Saudi Arabia. If we don't think anyone is watching very closely, we'll happily grab some from Venezuela. The Germans can't do that. They need reliability. They're in a tough neighborhood. They have precision manufacturing. So they prefer large contracts with state companies that deliver the energy on fixed infrastructure for long term. And that was Gazprom, the Russian monopoly. But without that pipeline, everything about their system is thrown into doubt because, again, the Germans don't run things like we do. They use that natural gas not just to fuel their electricity system, but also their petrochemical system. And those petrochemicals are not exported. They're kept in-house in order to provide the base material for their entire manufacturing sector. Well, the first step in that chain is now broken beyond repair. So the entire German industrial model is breaking down. If you want a Beamer, buy it now. This is the last model. Be sure to get 10 years of parts. You're going to need them. And it's going to get so much worse because this is the backup plan. Pipes that go through the conflict zone in an artillery war where one side is deliberately destroying infrastructure. This is going to get so much worse in Europe before it gets better. All right. Natural gas in Germany, let's talk dairy. Again, green's where it comes from, red where it's go, and this is what's going away. The Germans are the largest economy in Europe. They're the ones who pay for Europe. And if they have an industrial breakdown that they can't recover from, the European budget dissolves. That means the Common Agricultural Project goes away. And for the major dairy exporters in Europe who wouldn't exist if not for the subsidy structures, specifically the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, that means that entire block of competition vanishes because they have no market reason to exist if it wasn't for the subsidy system. Now, the French stuff is still there. The Italian stuff is still there. Those are niche products. Those are quality driven. They have their own market case. They're fine. And my God, the Kiwis are going nowhere. But for that mid-quality bulk production that you go head-to-head with in every market, that just goes away. One more little thing before we dive into some other stuff. We're in the final decade of the Chinese system, and that collapse might be forward positioned. We'll get into that a little bit more later. Chairman Xi of China has consolidated more power into his person than any human in history, more than the Kim dynasty in North Korea, more than Nero of Rome. He is so paranoid, he is so isolated, and he has shot the messenger so many times that no one will bring him any information at all. Not information that they think might make him mad, any information at all, because they don't know the status of the debate with the voices in his head, and they don't know what's going to set him off. So we're seeing catastrophic policy decisions across the board. Last May, the country was suffering from nationwide brown and blackouts. Xi didn't find out until September. You know who told him? Joe Biden. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that there's a diversity of well-thought-out opinions in this room on Uncle Joe. But I don't think any of us think of Uncle Joe as a source of breaking news. But Xi's basically locked himself in a closet. He's worse than Barack Obama at this point. And that means his information is limited to ideology, whether it's his own or ones that have been provided to him. So he bought Russian ideology. Whoa, my hair's falling apart here. He bought Russian ideology hook, line, and sinker. So back last February, 6 days before the war started in Ukraine, Putin was in Beijing. And he told Xi to his face, "Why would I invade Ukraine? That would be crazy." So Xi was the only world leader caught with his pants down. And can you imagine, like, the national security guys in the back of the room when that conversation was happening? Sir, there's 250,000 troops on the border. No, shut up. You know what he did to the last guy? His head's a paperweight. They believe their own propaganda. All this Taiwan stuff. Now, I am going to be of a minority here in that I don't think a Taiwan war is going to happen. Let me kind of lay that out for you. There are certain assumptions that you make when you're planning on conquering another country, and they guide your military transformation so that you're ready for the fight. The problem is that the Ukraine war has laid bare that all of the assumptions that the Chinese have made were wrong. I mean, assumption number one, it's going to be an easy fight. Well, that's been discarded because you have to swim to get to Taipei. You can walk to Kiev. The Ukrainians have been preparing for this war for 8 years. The Taiwanese have been preparing for a war with the mainland for 45. So, gone. Number two, Russian weapons are awesome, so let's steal the IP and clone them, spend $3 trillion outfitting all of our troops. They now know that that was $3 trillion wasted, and they don't have a weapon system appropriate for the game. Assumption number three, Russia's too important to international economics, so no one will punish it. They'll just, bitch, send out some press releases, and it'll be over. Error. And say what you will about the Russian economy, it's not great, but it is a massive producer and exporter of food and energy products. The Chinese are the world's largest importer of both. And they import 80% of the inputs that allow them to grow their own food. You take the sanctions on Russia, you put them on Beijing, you get a deindustrialization collapse complete with a famine that kills 500 million people in under 2 years. But I think the fourth one is what's really scared them. You. The entire Western corporate community just walked away. Not because of sanctions, because they didn't want to be affiliated with a genocidal government. They walked away from over $1 trillion of investment in the Russian space. Chairman Xi has no way to even process that. The idea that private citizens have agency. So every aspect of all of their strategic planning for the last half century has gone out the window because of Vladimir Putin. And this is normally where you would take all of your smart people and put them in a back room with some beer and some bourbon and say, don't come out until you can give me a plan B. But Chairman Xi has shot all those people. There's no one left. And so China is slamming its head into the wall over and over and over until something cracks. And the thing that cracks is not going to be Taiwan. And then, of course, there's COVID. I'm going to assume that there's a diversity of well-formed opinions in this room on COVID as well. But I think we can all agree that there's two possible paths here: mass immunization or mass exposure. And I think if we're all being really honest with ourselves at home, alone, in the dark, with the doors locked and the shades pulled, we will admit that the other side has a point or two that is worthy of consideration. Is that fair? Can't do that in China. We know from data from third countries that the Chinese vaccines don't work. And until very recently, the Chinese have been very successful at keeping COVID out of the general population, so no one had natural immunity. Well, we're now dealing with a challenge to Xi personally. Those protests that happened over Thanksgiving, they started with COVID, but it spread very rapidly, and this is one of the dangers of one-man rule. When the buck starts and stops with you, when anything goes wrong, everything goes wrong, because there's no backup source of legitimacy. This isn't the United States, where we've got academia and local government, and state government, and national government, and the business community, and religious organizations, and civic organizations. There is no civil society in China. And so when something cracks anywhere, every bit of discontent on everything boils up, and it all targets the source of the legitimacy, the one thing, Chairman Xi personally. And so he gave in, and now COVID is ravaging the population that is unprotected. The lowest number of fatality estimates that I have seen so far are 1.5 million. Remember, this is a country with over triple the population of the United States, with a less advanced healthcare system, especially for critical care. There are 7 variants circulated in the PRC right now. 4 of them we didn't know anything about 2 months ago. They didn't exist. So we have no data on how bad this is going to get. Because the Chinese, very Chinese of them, decided that rather than report fake data, they're just going to stop collecting data at all. So we just don't know. But this is very likely a regime-challenging system. And it could very well be a regime-ending event, because the one source of legitimacy is now being challenged each and every day across the entire system. In case you're still bullish on China, I'll give you one more reason. Let's talk tech. There's this weird belief in a lot of the world, especially the United States, that China and the United States are somehow technological peers. They are not. China cannot produce the high-end chips or the mid-quality chips. They can only do the low-end chips. So like, your singing margarita machine, that they make. But they can only make them with equipment that is imported, and with tools and software that are imported, and with workers who are brought in to do the quality checks that have to happen on every disk every single day. That's all imported labor too. What the Biden administration has done in the last couple of months is says you can't import the high-level chips, you can't import the middle quality chips, you can't import the equipment or the software or the tools. And any American working in that sector now has to choose between their job and their citizenship. And within 24 hours of that policy change, every American in the entire sector either quit or was transferred abroad. Folks, it's already over. And anything that comes from tech is already over. That's AI, that's automation, that's the Great Firewall, that's the social credit monitoring system, that's the hypersonic weapons program. It's all already over. China can assemble, and that's not nothing, but a technological peer it will never be. Okay. Oh, you beef guys are in trouble. Every time there's been a hiccup in China in the last 3 years, the beef guys are like, I bet this is an opportunity to sell more to the Chinese. It's like the pork guys have flipped. They've realized the writing on the wall. They've realized this is not a stable market long term, and they've diversified away. They've reduced the herd. You guys in beef are going to have to do this on a much more compressed time scale. Best get ready for it. All right, let's talk finance. Sorry, my hair is falling apart here. I haven't had long hair since I was like 19, so I'm still learning. What we're looking at here is total net worth by decade of age. As you get older, you get better at your career, your income increases, but the real magic happens when you turn 50. Because when you turn 50, your single biggest expense, your last kid, moves out and is someone else's problem. And the money that you save, you then use to pay down your second biggest expense, which is typically your house. And by 55 on average, you've paid that down to zero. So the last decade before you retire, 55 to 65, that's the wealthiest you will ever be. Your expenses are under control, your income's the highest it will ever be. This is 70% of global private capital. This is what drives the system. This is literally where the money is. And then you retire. And when you retire, you liquidate your stocks and your bonds and you go into T-bills and cash. Because if there's a market crash, or if there is a currency crash, you no longer have the income that's necessary to recover. Very typical, very normal. You go more conservative with your portfolio. And typically it hasn't mattered, because typically we've had a demographic structure that looks like this. Children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women at the other. This is normal. This is an early to pre-industrial system. And normally, when people who turn 65 retire, it doesn't matter because there's more people age 64 below that and 63 below that, and the capital structure is stable, things don't evolve. But this isn't what we look like anymore. And the issue is globalization. At the end of World War II, the Americans changed the way the world works. And instead of having to develop yourself and defend your trade, we said that we would use our Navy to patrol the global oceans for everyone so that anyone could go anywhere and trade anything whenever they wanted. And that changed national economics. Because it used to be if you had food and coal and iron ore and oil, you could make something of yourself. Maybe you could expand into empire. But if you were lacking just one of those, you were probably a colony, a pre-industrial colony. In globalizing the system, you didn't need all four anymore. Now you only needed one. You could trade for the others. And the whole world started to develop. And that meant industrialization and especially urbanization. Because in pre-industrial, we all lived on the farm, and kids are free labor, so you have a whole bunch of them. But when you move into town to take those industrial jobs, kids are no longer free labor. You live in a condo, they're just really loud, really dirty, really annoying, really expensive pieces of mobile furniture. And adults are not stupid, so we started having fewer. And if you fast forward that for 70 years, this is our demographic structure today. Suddenly it matters when people turn 65. The baby boomers are the largest generation we have ever had. And on average, they turned 65 last quarter. It's done. The flip has happened. Now, when you change your investment portfolio to make it safer for you, that means that capital is no longer available for everyone else. And what we're going through right now is a transition from the capital-rich environment of the baby boomers having not yet retired to the capital-poor environment of the baby boomers having retired. We're right on the precipice right now. We've already actually taken that step, which means that the capital costs in the United States compared to January of 2021 have to go up by at least a factor of 5 between then and December of this year. We're about halfway through that process right now. This is independent of anything the Federal Reserve does. This is demographics. This is locked in. So we know we are going to have higher capital costs for a very long time because we have to wait for another large generation to become capital rich. There's also a labor component. Baby boomers, largest generation ever. That also means that they were the largest workforce ever. Here's the replacement generation. They're the smallest generation we've ever had. In calendar year 2022, the difference between the exiting boomers and the entering zoomers was 400,000 workers. That number is going to go up each and every year for the next 12 until peaking in 2034 at about 900,000. How do we know? They're already here. They're already born. We know exactly what the outflow and the inflow year by year is for the next 20 years. We have to wait if we want this to get fixed. How long? Well, take a look at this. Now, here are the big four economies. And this is what really matters to the United States. These are the millennials. Second largest generation ever. Which means when they hit 55, which is not that far off, I can't wait for millennials to have midlife crises, the capital situation will fix itself. That's 2034. And when the millennials' kids enter the workforce, large generation generates a large generation, the workforce situation will get better. That's 2044. We just have to wait 10 years for finance to fix itself and 20 years for labor to fix itself. That's all we have to do. Wait just a decade or two. But look at everybody else. Look, check out Germany. They hit a terminal position with their demography 40 years ago. It's not that they're running out of children. That happened back in the 90s. They're now running out of working age adults. The German industrial model was always going to collapse this decade. The Ukraine war is just speeding it up. And then there's China. This was already the world's fastest aging workforce. And we now know that this data is wrong. The Chinese are now admitting publicly that they overcounted their population by at least 120 million. And all of the missing millions would have been born since the one-child policy was adopted 40 years ago, which means that all the missing millions are under aged 40, suggesting that these yellow bars don't even exist. This is not a country in demographic decline. This is a country in the advanced stages of demographic collapse. And if this data proves true, and I have no reason at this point to think otherwise, not only is a domestically driven economy impossible, they have to export, there's no young people to buy this stuff. Not only are we seeing their labor costs now triple of what they are in Mexico, that's not projection, that's where it is today. You're talking about a country whose population peaked around 2012, and Americans on average have been younger than the Chinese since 2008. This is a system that will not last the decade, just by the numbers. Don't rely on China for anything. It's not going to be there much longer. Oh, thank God. There were a lot of things about Donald Trump I was not a fan of. NAFTA 2 negotiated when it was, how it was, and with who? Brilliantly done. This is the healthiest demography, not just in the rich world, but among their own peer class. This is better than Turkey, better than India, better than Brazil. And courtesy of NAFTA 2, all the hard work on that is done, it's implemented. This is our primary trading partner, and it will be for the rest of the lives of everyone in this room. This is the partner you want. This is the partner we have. All right, a little bit more on energy. This is total investment into all oil and all gas from all government and all private. Now, back in 2014, at the peak there, a narrative took hold that fossil fuels were done, and not for environmental reasons, for financial reasons. The logic is that if it takes 3 to 8 years from the point of investment for a new field to come online, and then another 5 to 15 years of operation for that field to break even and pay back the initial investment. Well, if the goal is to be carbon neutral by 2040, we're already too late. Why would you put your money into a project that you know you'll never break even on? Now, there's a freight train of logical disconnects in that argument, but it took hold in the financial centers in New York and London and the rest. And we got something called ESG. Now, luckily, what is true for the average is not true for each individual piece. And there's one individual piece that matters more than the rest. I like to call this the checkbook map, because every dot is someone who has paid their power bill. Here are the world's conventional oil and natural gas basins. In one snapshot, this is the agony of globalization, getting the energy from where it's produced to where we actually live. But here's where the commercially viable shale is. There are 20-odd reasons why American energy is fundamentally different from energy everywhere else. This is by far the most important one, considering the issues of the day. We produce it where we live. Transport for us is a minor issue. In addition, it only takes 3 to 8 weeks to bring a shale project online, not 3 to 8 years. Now, that was back in 2019 before we had the everything in shortage economy. Now it's more like 3 to 8 months, but that's still an order of magnitude better, which gives the United States a lot of flexibility in doing everything. Same concept, checkbook map, upper Midwest here. This is by far the most important cluster of checkbooks in the history of human civilization. This is Marshalltown, Iowa. This is where I'm from. Here we have Bismarck, North Dakota. Should you happen to find yourself in Bismarck, you're going to have to ask yourself the very serious question, how the hell did that happen? Where did Bismarck burn? And here we have what is not a frat party. It's lit up because of a problem with transport. This is the Bakken shale field. Now, oil is a liquid. It conforms to the shape of a container. You can put it into a rail car, a tanker truck, whatever you want. But natural gas, as the name implies, is a gas. So you have to have a leak-free system to gather it, to transport it, to distribute it, and to use it. And because containing gases is difficult and expensive, it all has to flow through at the same rate. Now, in the United States, we have the world's largest, most redundant, most flexible natural gas system, but we can't keep up with the stuff that is bubbling up out of the shale oil projects as a byproduct. And so we have to flare it until the infrastructure can catch up. Sometimes that takes upwards of a year. You can see those flares from space. And it's the same in Texas and the Eagle Ford and the Permian, which means here, only here, natural gas has traditionally been priced as a waste product. And that changes a whole lot of things. Here's Henry Hub. This is our primary natural gas processing facility and price point. For those of you who are from the Gulf Coast, you of course know what these are. These are hurricanes. It's an old story. Storm comes through, they quick shut down everything, evacuate the rigs, storm does its damage, they come out the next day and they spend not days, not weeks, months, sometimes even years untangling the damage. And you get a price spike. Or you did until 2009. Because in 2009, that was the year that the majority of the natural gas consumed in North America was sourced from US shale, primarily as a waste product. We've got this nice long stretch below 4. We have any Texans? A few? You guys know what this is. This is January of 2021, when Texas got cold, got down to 25, lasted for a week and a half. Oh my God, everything stopped. Coal, natural gas, oil, nuclear, wind, so it just all broke down. There were snowmen in San Antonio. They were sad snowmen, but they lasted a week. This is what we've all been bitching about recently. At the peak in September, we hit 9. $9 natural gas in inflation index terms is exactly the 50-year average. We are bitching about average energy prices in the country. Here's what the Chinese and the Europeans are dealing with. Folks, this is not an aberration. This is the new normal. 3 to 8 years to bring a new project online, that assumes that the transport infrastructure is already in place, which it is not. The closest natural gas to Germany that might be able to be brought online in less than 10 years is in Nigeria. Not the best investment environment, just for those of you who are not familiar with Africa. This is locked in now. Assuming nothing else goes wrong, this is the split we're looking at for the next decade. So many other things are going wrong. Now, well, actually, let me go back real quick. One of the top demands for natural gas after electricity is for nitrogen fertilizer generation. From roughly July until a week ago, the Europeans had just stopped making it. Now, because it's so warm in Europe right now, they're turning some of that stuff back on. But BASF, the chemical major, the German chemical major, one of the largest chemical companies in the world, they made the decision back in June that this is just how it's going to be now. They are physically dismantling their chemical plants and picking them up and moving them to Louisiana to tap US shale gas. Working from the theory that if they can produce enough chemicals here, they can ship them back to Germany and maybe save their economic model. But that would require a physical infrastructure build out in Louisiana that is faster than what the Nazis did during World War II. This is just where we are now. Final fertilizer component is phosphate. Comes from the blue, goes to the red, which means it's a China story. All right, you guys, who's in swine? Who does pork? African swine fever get you a little nervous sometimes? So the Chinese 3 years ago had the world's largest ever outbreak. And since then, since culling about 2/3 of the herd, they haven't had a single case. Yeah, bullshit. Now, the way the lab testing works here is you take your sample, you send it to a lab. When they get the results, what do? They call you. Maybe they email you. That's not how it works in China. In China, once you have your test kit, you send in your sample, the sample results go to the CCP. And then the CCP tells you if you have a positive case or not. So no positive cases in 3 years. More likely, there's already a low-level raging epidemic throughout the entire system. And considering the general breakdown in policy that we're seeing across China, I don't think it's going to be quiet much longer. We can look indirectly to see how the Chinese are anticipating this. They've stopped exports of phosphate for the most part, because they know if they lose pork again, the only crop that they can control is rice, the only one that's culturally significant, and rice is the most phosphate-hungry crop that humans grow. So they've stopped exports for food security reasons. Makes sense. Well, that was the world's largest supplier. And there isn't a backup plan for most places. It used to be, in a pre-globalized world where we had to be a lot more self-sufficient, that in agriculture, fertilizer came from what was on hand, and so we co-located animal and plant agriculture in order to access the manure. But with globalization, we've all focused on specializing. And so we now grow our cash crops in places with the perfect weather and the perfect soil, and anything else gets moved further and further away. So what you're looking at the left is row crop, and on the right is where the beef is. You'll notice that in most situations, these are no longer co-located. There are a couple exceptions: Wisconsin, Iowa, eastern Nebraska. Dairy country. They're still co-located. They're still an option. But for everyone else, you're talking about some serious shipping. And for everyone else in the world, this split is usually not in the same country anymore. So you do something to the phosphate supply chain system, and all of a sudden, you lose one of your nutrients, unless you're in Iowa. Give you an idea of what that looks like at scale. This is row crop in Africa in 1950, and anything that is in purple or blue, 40% or less of the land is under crop. And in a pre-industrial system, this is what you would expect. You only grow food on the good land. You just don't get a return at all on the marginal land. But with globalization, we introduced pesticides and fertilizers and finance and machinery, and this is what they looked 50 years later. Anything that is in orange or red is 40% or more is under crop. And the continent saw an increase in food output by a factor of 5 because of industrialized inputs. Now do that in reverse, because that's where we're heading starting later this year. I hate this graphic. This is the one that gives me the nightmares. This is a calorie map, grain and soy-based calories. Blues and dark greens, those are the world's major producers and exporters. Everyone else is a net importer. And in a world where the fertilizer supply chain system breaks down, these are the countries looking at least a 40% reduction in their ability to grow the crop in the first place. This is a multi-continental famine. Now, for those of you in ag, which is all of you, you're going to try to feed the world because our supply chain system, for the most part, is not interrupted. You're going to fail. And you're going to feel bad about it because we're talking, this is 1 billion people starving to death. But then you're going to look at your bank accounts and you're probably going to get over it real fast. Give you an idea of the exposure. So here are our 3 main nutrients: nitrogen, phosphate, potash. The big number on the left is the percent that we import. And you'll notice that for nitrogen and phosphate, we're largely self-sufficient. Now down at the bottom there, potash, that's our weak point. We import most of our potash. But most of it comes from Canada. So, they are good for something. This little chunk, these little slivers, that's the only part that is coming from the conflict zone. It's not that we won't feel it, but it's not really going to affect our bottom line. Here's Brazil and Australia. They're more typical of the global average. Oh, but we're not done because this is the stuff that comes from China. Now, the story will be different based on where you're looking because it's a question of trade and politics and economic patterns and supply patterns and soil quality. Do we have anyone from Wisconsin? Where are my cheeseheads? You guys know, of course, what this is. This is winter. Winter's great for farmers. Not only do you get to come to Kansas City and have some barbecue, but it's a soil recharge cycle, AKA free fertilizer. Can't do that in Brazil. This is the Cerrado. This is the big agricultural explosion zone that they've seen over the last 30 years. It's a semi-tropical savanna with erratic weather, but the real problem is the vegetation. If you want to clear this land, you wait for it to rain, you throw a chain around the trunk of the tree, you drag it out with a piece of heavy equipment by the roots, and then you poison it with lime for 3 to 20 years until you get the pH down, or pH up, deacidify. Then you're left with something that's like beach sand. Doesn't matter as long as there's a bottomless supply of low-cost fertilizer, like there has been for the last 30 years. But if you remove that singular input, this is a desert. And it's in the process of turning into one right now. Now, Brazil, big country, deep pockets, they have managed to pre-position a lot of fertilizer in, but they've gone through the reserve, most countries have. And with the Russian stuff continuing to go offline, this is going to be incrementally more difficult to maintain yields. And when Brazil goes off, it goes off completely, because without the fertilizer, there is no story, because there is no soil nutrients. All right, one final crop. Wheat is about to get super sexy. Now, wheat is normally a weed, and that's why most people don't like talking about it. Wheat farmers have been incredibly unloved for decades because just as dairy and beef have been separated from row crops, wheat has been pushed to the side. It's drought tolerant, it's cold tolerant, it's heat tolerant, it's flood tolerant. You grow it only in places where you cannot grow anything else. Even the Ukrainians are moving away from it because they have limited export options. And so the green here is row crop. The brown is wheat row crop specifically. And you'll notice it's not on the good land as a rule. Sorry, Kansas. But we can only grow it in those zones with industrial level inputs. Marginal land with industrial level inputs can grow wheat. Marginal land without those inputs cannot. And this pattern has happened the world over. About the only place that they still grow wheat on the good land, France, because croissants, and India and Pakistan for food security issues. That's it. Everyone else, it's on the edges. You break down the industrial input system, most of the brown goes away. Now again, in the United States and North America, I am not concerned because we produce what we need locally for those inputs. But for everyone else, wheat is the product that is going to suffer the greatest production declines, which means that wheat is the product that is most likely to experience the greatest price increases because it remains humanity's #1 source of calories. You can have wheat or you can die. All right, final slide. This is CPI, inflation in the United States and Canada, similar systems, heavily interlinked. You would expect the data to track, it does. We have 3 big phases of inflation since World War II. We first had that initial urbanization and industrialization push. We built the interstate highway system. We ran power into the countryside. We built the cities. Industrial demand-driven inflation. Then the baby boomers came of age. They bought their homes, they raised their kids. Consumer demand-driven inflation. And now we've been living in this weird-ass period. The Soviet system collapsed, and that dumped an empire worth of raw materials on the world, keeping the commodity prices under control. The Chinese brought 1 billion workers to the global workforce, and that pushed down the cost of manufactured goods. And these trends lasted for 30 years. Well, folks, the disinflationary trends are turning inflationary, and the inflationary trends are back. The Chinese system is going away. That's inflationary. The Russian stuff is going away. That's inflationary. We need to double the size of the industrial plant to make up for the loss of Germany and China. Wildly inflationary. And while the baby boomers may be retiring, their kids, the millennials, are now in their prime for consumption. We're looking at 9 to 15% inflation a year for at least the next 5. Now, before you have a stroke and call your broker, deep breath. This is a good story. We need to double the size of the industrial plant. We need to fully integrate Mexico. Mexico is a food importer. They're your #1 consumer. We are talking about the greatest growth story in Canadian, Mexican, and American history as we build out that industrial plant. And when we are done, not only will inflation go down, we will have a supply chain system that is domestic, that employs locals, that is cleaner, that uses less energy, and where the end product is produced where we live. This is the greatest economic story of our country's history. Or we could choose to not do it, and 5 years from now, not only do we not have stuff because China and Germany are gone, but we still have the inflation. Now, one of these is a great story, one of these is kind of crappy. I am not the decision maker who makes that happen. That would be you, because you guys are the ones who decide where you buy stuff from. Buying within North America is no longer a patriotic issue. It's an issue of economic stability for the next several decades. This is a good story. Okay, that's it for me. If you're looking for more, the link on the left goes to the newsletter. It is free. It will always be free. I will never share your data. The link on the right goes to a charity that I'm backing with basically all the income that comes in from the books. It's called MedShare. They're providing medical assistance to communities who, for reasons beyond their own control, can't provide it themselves. So, for example, if the Russians are sending missiles into your hospitals, MedShare steps in to help. This link goes directly to their Ukraine fund. All right. I'm sure I'm over. Do we have time for some Q&A? How do you want to do this?
Any questions?
Okay, we'll do a little Q&A. Anybody?
Yeah, you didn't talk much about India.
India.
With India's population exploding versus China, what's their role for U.S. agriculture?
Okay, what's the role for U.S. agriculture in India? Now, obviously, there's not an animal protein story in India that's very big. What animal protein they need, they grow themselves. It's primarily zebu. But for plant agriculture, I think it has a really bright future. Now, the Indian population is doing the same thing that everyone else has done. It's aging very rapidly, much more rapidly than the Europeans did, actually. In the midterm, 10 to 30 years, this is a really good thing. Because if you have a lot of people aged 20 to 50 who don't have a lot of kids, they will buy more and better food because they have more income to spend on that. And that is the Indian story for the next generation. Now, you fast forward to 2050, 2060, that picture is going to change. I don't think a lot of us are overly worried about 2060 at this point. Is that fair? Okay. What we're going to be seeing in India is a massive industrial build-out, because they have to do the same thing that we do. They need to increase their industrial supply system to supply themselves. They can't rely on the Chinese like they have to this point. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be part of an integrated system like we are. For us, the Mexican labor market is very complementary. India doesn't have a partner like that, and they don't want a partner like that. So it will all be domestically driven, which means it's going to have quality issues, and they're not going to trade a lot. But if all they do is build enough manufactured goods for 1 billion people, that's still a pretty big growth story, and it's stable.
What about the excess Russian nat gas? Where's it going to go? Here right now, it's getting upgraded into urea and get launched through countries like Turkey and Romania.
Sure. The question is what happens to all the excess Russian natural gas? Is it just going to be processed into intermediate goods and laundered? Some of that can happen. The problem is that there's a limit to what the Russians can do because their industrial plant is maxed out and largely maintained by foreigners. So there will be some incremental stuff like that in places like Turkey. Turkey's doing something similar with steel, actually. And some of the oil to this point that they've been able to export goes to India, and then the Indians repackage it, put a different name on it, and send it out as well. The problem is twofold. Number one, the industrial accidents are getting more and more common, and the Russians lack the technical acumen to do most of the repairs themselves. The second problem is that insurance question, because if it has to go by water, then you have to still get out of the country, and the reinsurance companies have already stepped back and said no policies at all. So that will happen on the margins, but overall we're looking at most of the baseline going offline. The question is timing. In the case of natural gas, there's a little bit less flexibility with oil because it's just harder to move. And as the Europeans are backing away, that's where 80% of the transport infrastructure goes. So anything that wants to be redirected has to get a new pipeline. You don't do that in a year. The last pipeline that the Russians built to China took 11 years. And that's with the Chinese doing most of the work. There's really not a good way to speed that up.
Excuse me, Peter. We're going to go ahead and keep the conference going. Everybody give Peter a round of applause for his awesome information that he gave us all today.
Thank you very much.
You got